Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Ohioana Book Festival. I'm David Weaver, the Executive Director of the Ohioana Library Association, and pleased to welcome you to Cocktails and Conversation with Thrity Umrigar, moderated by Dave Lucas. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you to our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thanks also to our official bookseller, the Book Loft of German Village. Today is Indie Bookstore Day. You can get copies of all the books featured at the festival by going online to bookloft.com. I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's program because these happen to be not just two wonderful authors, but two friends of mine. My dear friend, Thrity Umrigar. Hello, Thritty.
Hi, David.
And my other good friend, Dave Lucas. Hello, Dave.
How are you, David? Glad to be here.
Yes, indeed. Thrity Umrigar has been published as a novelist, as a memoirist. She's also written 3 wonderful books for children, including the Ohioana award-winning Sugar and Milk. And her most recent book is the novel Honor. And Dave Lucas was Ohio's second poet laureate, and he was the winner of the Ohioana Book Award in 2012 for his first collection, Weather. He also is the founder of the program in Cleveland called Brews and Prose at Market Garden Brewery. And their slogan is, literature goes better with beer, which we all agree. And I'm delighted to say that both Thritty and Dave, in addition to being Ohioana Book Award winners, are also recipients of the very prestigious Cleveland Arts Prize. So I did say beforehand, we said cocktails and conversation. I told people, somebody asked, can we put in the chat box where we're from and what we're drinking? And I said, hey, go for it. Okay, so I'm in Dublin, Ohio, and I'm having Sutter Home Cabernet Sauvignon, $6.99 for a 4-pack at Kroger or Giant Eagle. So anyway, a delightful conversation is in store for us. I'm very delighted to introduce once again our moderator, Dave Lucas, who's going to introduce in more detail our very special guest, Thrity Umrigar.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Great to be here.
Is David getting kickbacks from Giant Eagle and Kroger?
That's what I thought. Yeah, that was maybe they're sponsoring the event. We don't know.
Very cannily done, David. Well done.
No, and everything. Yes, a little commercialism there and everything, but I'm happy they do that. It's a good deal.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with my dear friend Thrity Umrigar. And although we live just a street away from each other, this is probably the most face-to-face time we've had in quite a while. But as it happens, I am coming to you from Mentor, Ohio, not from my usual spot. I'm coming to you so that my mom, in whose house I'm sitting right now, has the chance to hear from her favorite author in conversation with her, I think probably third or fourth favorite author. Yeah. So thank you for being here for that. Thritty, let me ask one really important question first. What are you drinking?
A margarita.
Okay.
Early summer.
I just do the whiskey out of the brown paper bag, but I'm at my mom's, so I've got a fancy snifter. And I took a sip a moment ago, and my questions already seem smarter. So thank you for.
And you're slurring your words for some strange reason. I don't get it.
Yeah, that you don't have to point that out. I think that probably if you're tuning in tonight, you have some sense of Thrity Umrigar's work as a writer. You might not have, though, as much of a sense of her work as a teacher, as a colleague, as a neighbor, as a friend. And I can't possibly tell you about all of that right now. So I'll just say that she's great at all of it. Beloved as a teacher, the sort of friend upon whom one can rely in an instant. The sort of colleague about whom I would say both of those things at the same time. And as a neighbor, the yard is immaculate. So all of those things are true.
Do you remember where I live? I know it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. Yeah.
Those dead leaves, that's my yard.
So Thritty, we're talking, I think, mostly about this book, Honor.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, first of all, let's say that someone who knows and loves your work, nevertheless, for some reason, has not yet managed to read this novel. First of all, we scold them, we shake our heads in dismay and can't figure out why they would.
I think we should shame them.
Yeah,
Dave.
well, I'm working on it. Yeah. But second, how would you describe what they're about to encounter if they're about to crack the book open and start reading?
Okay. So I guess this is a beautiful way of simply saying, what is the book about? You know, maybe I'll give you a synopsis, overview of the subject matter. In honor, I wanted to tell the story of two women who both of Indian origin, but of very, very different educational and class backgrounds. One character is Smita. She's an Indian American journalist who finds herself almost against her wishes. I mean, she steps foot in India after an absence of 20 years. She leaves when she's a teenager, returns as Brooklyn-based, New York City-based journalist. She's a global correspondent, but for reasons unknown to us, she has vowed never to step foot in India again. But she thinks she's going there to help a friend who's based in India and is covering this important story. She thinks she's going to help her for medical reasons. She ends up taking over this story that this other woman, Shannon, has been covering. And this story involves Meena, a young, illiterate woman living in rural India, who has committed the great, great crime of marrying outside her religion. She is Hindu. She falls in love and marries a Muslim guy. And basically, all the wrath of this little village, this isolated village in which she grew up, descends on her, and she pays an extremely heavy price for this one transgression. Mm. So the book really is about these two women sort of being pushed into a kind of alliance. I'm saying that wrong. It's basically about what they each have to say to one another, perhaps teach one another. And one of the things, Dave, that I was interested in trying out in this book is, I didn't want sort of the affluent, educated savior trope. I didn't want Smita with all her sophistication and worldliness to sort of swoop in and better Meena's life in some way. I was really looking to complicate that trope a little bit. And I think what ends up happening is it's actually Meena who ends up being the teacher in ways that I won't quite reveal right now, because hopefully now that we've shamed people into picking up the book, maybe somebody will actually read it.
And I mean, without spoiling anything, I want to ask you about point of view narration in a moment. And maybe that's part of the answer to this question, but how does one as an author go about trying to write from the perspective of a character? And we get Smita's perspective through a sort of loose third person omniscient point of view. How does one go about that without falling into that trap of transforming the Indian American woman returning home into the savior while she's also the protagonist, or at least one of the protagonists?
Not sure I completely understood the question. The margarita might be having some. Would you just say?
How do you as an author, how do you avoid that trap of turning your main character into a simplistic savior figure?
I see. Well, by not making her a simplistic stick figure, right? And I think you do what always works in fiction, I think, which is to give somebody a very credible backstory. I mean, people have, seemingly people share certain characteristics, but we all know this from real life. I mean, once you probe deep into somebody, into any individual life, people are gloriously varied in their life experience and how they react to it. So for me, when I'm creating characters, I will not put pen to paper until I have a really, really good sense of what somebody's story is, what somebody's backstory is. And especially in this novel, for me to have initially understood Smita's experience in India, her backstory, and how that has shaped her as this rather, how should we characterize her? Rather flinty, brittle kind of a person in many ways. You know, she's seemingly outwardly very, very successful, very confident, and yet there is this this cowering teenager somewhere within her that she has to eventually deal with and face up to. So I think it's those kinds of things that one does in a novel to hopefully escape, you know, writing a stick figure or a stereotypical figure.
How did this book get started for you, as a novel about a journalist, getting started in the mind of someone who is both journalist and novelist? How did this book come to be?
So a few years before I actually started writing the book, I just happened upon a bunch of really fabulous long form journalism pieces in the New York Times written by a writer that I really admire. Her name is Ellen Berry. And Ellen at that time was based in South Asia. So she was spending a lot of time covering really kind of the kind of topics in India that most journalists, I think Indian and foreign, was shying away from. And she did a series of stories about life in the villages in rural India. And the first story, I think the first story that I read of hers in this context was a story about a group of very intrepid women, I dare say, either undereducated or perhaps not educated at all, who defied the will. They grew up in this very patriarchal society, it sounds like, but there was a job opening, some factory opened, you know, X number of miles away from the village. And they decided collectively to apply for jobs there, apply for employment. And this one small, for us, small event was like an earthquake went off in this village. And Ellen just explored this issue, all of it, the political dimensions of it, the economic dimensions of it, very, very brilliantly. And I have to say, Dave, that as somebody who, you know, spent the first 21 years of her life in India, I was still taken aback and horrified at some of the sort of punishments that were meted out against these women, you know, how they were ostracized by the village elders. I mean, it took my breath away. And of course, it also gave me the sense of, good God, I mean, what kind of courage does it take to stand up for your rights in a setting that's so narrow and close, you know? And I just couldn't get that story out of my mind. And then consequently, I read a few other pieces that she had done that just spoke about the conditions in the villages, the corruption in the police force, just all these things. And I think a year or two perhaps went by, and I kept thinking, somebody should tell this story. Somebody should make a movie out of these women and what they have been facing. And initially, I certainly didn't think I was that somebody, you know. And then at some point, I thought, "Oh heck, why not?"
Really,
you know?
hold on. I'm gonna bother you about that for just
Yeah.
really, because every author that I know, including you, at certain times has when an idea that good comes up or a story that good comes up,
Yes.
we get turfy, we get
It
protective.
wasn't an
You didn't
idea.
think so?
It wasn't an idea for a long time.
Okay.
When I read the story that I just spoke about in detail about getting employment outside, I just kept seeing it while I was reading it as a movie with just that cast of characters. You know, I didn't think the story was so good. I didn't think it needed to be improved upon. I just thought if somebody just filmed what she was writing about, it would be a great film, you know? So there was no role for me, since I'm not a filmmaker, there was no role for me in that, you know? But as time, you know how story ideas grow and develop, it's like a tree that just branches sprout and then leaves come on it and different things happen. And as time went by, I you know, the whole concept of honor killings entered into it. And then I thought, what if one of these real life characters had committed yet another transgression, which would be falling in love with somebody outside their religion? Then what would happen? So it was like building blocks. And by the time it went from the realm of reality into imagination, then there was a role for me in that story, you know. So
This
so
is
I'm
the way
not,
you find your way into finding the angle that
yeah,
that is the novelist's angle.
most of the time. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky in the past with a few books where, I mean, an entire plot with names of the characters attached has come to me in the span of 30 seconds. I know how absurd that sounds. And if you want to push back, this is the moment to push back against that.
I know. I remember you talking about this sort of mythical shower that you took. In which, what book was it that all came?
Everybody's Son.
Everybody's
I'll never forget
Son.
it because it's never happened since. You know, where the whole book just like unfolded. You know, so sometimes the gods smile and it gets easy, but most of the time you're building a story. You know, and it sometimes can take a year or two before you actually think, okay, I've tested it, I've kicked the tires, this is solid, I can now write about this, you know?
Yeah. So once you're into it, once you've got that sort of point of leverage from which to work your way into the story, and you've admitted to yourself, yeah, I guess I am writing, this is the book I am writing. Once you're at that point, in this case, what surprised you most in writing this novel? I would love to hear about what surprised you writing all of your novels, but this one in particular, I'd love to know about.
Maybe this should not have surprised me at all, because what I'm about to say sounds pretty obvious, but I think this novel probably had more violence to it and a couple of scenes that are pretty brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was surprised at how shaken up I was myself in my own life, you know, after I would do a day's work on those scenes. Again, it sounds like, you know, stating the obvious that I should have been shook up by whenever you're, you know, writing about really, really grim and unpleasant things. But for some reason, the impact that those had on me, you know, how that feeling of dread and whatever, that heaviness, you know, how you just carry it beyond the computer, beyond your work for the day, into sort of seeps into everything else that you're doing really around that time. Perhaps that was the thing that surprised me the most in the writing of this novel. It was a different challenge than what I have faced in the past.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I mean, and those scenes of violence too. I mean, I think, I imagine that a number of readers, certainly myself included, found them deeply jarring. I mean, I think they jarred us in the way that that perhaps hearing the stories of honor killings in the first place might have jarred you into wanting to write about it, or feeling, maybe not even wanting, but the sense of, this is a story that needs to be told, and perhaps I've got some way of addressing it.
Right. And I think, you know, so Mina's story came first, and Mina's story came, as I've said before, basically based on and then embellished from the journalism pieces that I read, but Smita's story, and Smita has a pretty powerful backstory also, and that came that was much more, I don't know if abstract is exactly the right word, but that was, I can't draw a linear line as I can with Mina's story, but Smita's story, you know, without giving much of the plot away, was based on a historical event that actually happened in Bombay a good 10 years or so after I had left and moved to the United States. But, you know, I still had family there. And I remember how horrified they were by what had happened to the beloved city. And I remember how it shook me up as a as a relatively young person, who had built a life in America, 10,000 miles away. But that sense that you have of the place where you grow up, that sense of security that you feel, and at least in those days, those of us who grew up, I would say, relatively middle class in Bombay, it was sort of the shiny city. It was the city that was different than the rest of India. It was the most cosmopolitan city in India. It still is in many ways. And you didn't think that the kind of turmoil that would grip the rest of the country periodically, somehow we felt we were better than, and that we were immune to it. So that sense of place, that sense of security, frankly, that sense of pride, perhaps some would call it arrogance, that we felt, that was shattered. It turned out to be a myth. And I remember that feeling. I remember writing some essays in the early 1990s about exactly what I'm talking about, how that relationship with your city is gone. My city is gone. There's a different feeling now. And somehow, all these decades later, I drew on that feeling. And Dave, I'll just tell you a quick story about what happened with my family around that time. Mm-hmm. And I say this to you because you and I have discussed our fathers quite a bit in the past, and I think you will appreciate this. So while this incident was going on, we had at that time some Muslim neighbors, and my dad told me the story very nonchalantly, a little later over the phone. And they stopped by his house with a bag full of jewelry and their possessions, and they requested him to keep it, in his home for safekeeping. And this was, I wouldn't say it was commonplace, but certainly people do, right? Neighbors help. I mean, we're seeing that in Ukraine right now. People help each other. So that in itself was not uncommon. I think what was a little uncommon was my father, instead of just meeting them at the door and taking this away from them, he led them to his bedroom where he had a safe. He opened the safe. He took out all his possessions. He put this cloth bag into the safe. He locked it and he gave them the key. And he said, whenever you're ready, after all this blows over, come back and, take your stuff. That way there's no question of, is something missing, all that. And again, my father just tells me the story as if it's some everyday happening. But I remember thinking at that time, he's a good man, to have thought about this on the spur of the moment. So that part of Smita's story talks about both the good and bad, talks about, what's happening on the street level, where people collude with, just to protect their own families. But then there are also acts of individual kindness and heroism that always happen in any situation.
And so it sounds like, was that the inspiration for, without spoiling anything, for a particular scene?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think
it was in a bit different direction.
Writers are just, they're birds. You collect a twig here and a branch here, and 30 years later you build a nest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to me to hear you talk about the sense of those who live in Bombay or in Mumbai feeling a bit perhaps haughty about where they live as opposed to the rest of the country, because that's the sort of dynamic that we also see in the early pages of the book as Smita returns to her home country for the first time in 20 years. And we learn that it's a country that she does not even really consider home in the process of it. That moment and what you describe now highlight what for me seems a persistent tension in the book, and that's between the adjective and noun in describing oneself as Indian or Indian American. And those differences come to light a number of times, sometimes working against Smita, sometimes working in her favor, but always complicated. And I wonder if that's something that you could talk about, that tension, As someone who has lived in the States for a long time now, but has family, as you said, thousands of miles away.
Right, right. Yeah, it's always, you know, what they call life on the hyphen. And I have to confess and say that unlike many of my peers, and by peers, I don't mean, you know, people of Indian origin necessarily. I mean, my literary peers who happen to be Indian American writers. I have never thought of life on the margins as something to be sorry about or something to be sad about. I have always seen it as a rare, rare privilege that, you know, let's face it, vast majority of people on this globe, on this planet, live stationary lives. You know, they're born in a country and they live out their lives in a country. It's a privileged few. That's how I choose to look at it, who get this opportunity to widen horizons, to experience different cultures. So I guess, to badly paraphrase Zora Neale Hurston, I'm not of the sobbing school of, you know, writers who sob about, you know, life on the margins and how difficult that is. I just think it's a glorious thing because I can really combine, you know, the best of all worlds and all cultures. Now, having said that, one of the things I've always noticed about myself is that I feel absolutely 1000% American when I'm in India. And when I'm in the US, I do feel American, but I often, especially if there's a political conversation going on or something, I find myself sort of with that third world mentality or pushback, you know? I mean, yeah, we're criticizing, you know, the Russians for the horrific stuff that's happening in Ukraine right now, but what has the US done to other sovereign countries in the past? You know, though I'm just a contrarian, I guess, by nature. So you know, I do
It sounds
struggle.
like the journalist in you, though, too.
Yeah, maybe. You know,
There's a moment in the book when Smita is sort of simultaneously annoyed but also in admiration of another character's, what she describes as his willingness to immediately stick up for strangers, and then she also at times is concerned about is she trying to adhere too much to this invented ethical moral code that perhaps does not apply in this situation. All of which I found really fascinating, but it also made me think about your life as a journalist, and in this case, writing as a novelist about a journalist. And what's that tension like for you, between writing as a journalist or writing about a journalist?
Yeah, I think I couldn't have written this book writing as a journalist. I had to treat Smita as a character who happens to be a journalist. I mean, if she was an architect, I would have had to, of course, the learning curve would have been a lot steeper because I don't know anything about being an architect. But there's no question that I borrowed and sort of gave to Smita some of the internal conflicts that I have had. One of the things I definitely sort of stole from my own life was when I was a Nieman Fellow. Basically, the way that works is there's 12 US journalists, of which I was one, and then there are 12 international fellows. And my class was a particularly close-knit and fun-loving, you know, we were always together and drank a lot and we did things together. And it was a great, great year, and it was a great group. The one area of tension that I noticed almost from the beginning was, you know, all the American journalists who are all products of American, you know, journalism schools, we all sort of lived and died by this credo of objectivity in journalism. Now, this was before the rise of cable news and all that. I can't imagine people are now having similar debates, but, you know, we did. The international fellows, you know, many of whom had covered civil war and foreign wars and famine and you name it, and they were seasoned hands at all this. they kept saying that this is almost an immoral position to take, for them to take in their situations, in their contexts, that advocacy journalism was the only moral, if you just present both sides evenly, in effect, you are negating the truth of an argument, right?
Mhm.
And I found myself, that was a case where I really found myself straddling the fence. I mean, when I talked to the American journalists, I would completely understand and agree with them. And then somebody would say an opposing argument. And I think, there's that too. I don't know. And I ended the year really not sure,
Mhm.
not sure what I truly believed. There is something wonderful about the reporter staying neutral, but is neutrality always the moral stance to take? And so that conflict, which was completely unresolved for me, I threw into Smita's lap and said, show me, how are you going to deal with this?
As a novelist, do you feel a similar tension, the need to be fair to your characters who are, after all, you've given them life. Now do you need to be fair to them, or do you get to play games with them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think my only responsibility towards my characters is always, always, always to understand them, not to excuse their behavior necessarily. I can have great objections to what they do, but I have to understand and believe their motivations for what they do. In other words, if somebody commits murder, I'm not going to approve of it, but I have to believe that they believe that they are doing it for the right reasons. I think this line, if I'm not mistaken, is not in honor, but in the book that I'm working on right now, where it says something like, no human is the villain of his or her own story, And I think that's really true for the most part. People have this amazing capacity to justify anything, And again, I don't excuse that, but I do have to understand that,
You opened the door to the book you're working on right now, but I'm going to hold off on that for a moment. And I want to ask you a couple more about this one. And I also want to remind everybody who's joining us that they are welcome to type questions for Thrity right into the chat for the Q&A. I don't know if there's, do we do a separate Q&A?
We can. I would love to.
I don't know. I was too busy pouring the whiskey to figure out how this works. So someone from Ohioana can tell us what the right.
Yeah, we always take questions from readers. So if there are any, otherwise we'll keep talking.
Okay. One thing that I was really fascinated by as I was reading, and because I'm somebody who, you were very kind earlier when you said, how stories happen. No, I don't. That's why I write poems. I don't know. I can't do plot. But one thing that was interesting to me in the plot of this book, and it's really a craft question, is that through, I want to say, at least the first book of the first section of the book, we're getting primarily this indirect free discourse through Smita's perspective. And then all of a sudden we get these italicized sections that are directly in a first person from Mina. I'm very curious about that decision as a craft decision on your part, and how else it might have gone if not that.
It's a great question. And obviously at some point it is a craft question, and it was a craft decision that that was the toughest part of the book for me to write, was to write Mina's sections in her own voice, addressed directly to us in the first person. And I'll explain why that was hard in just a minute. But as much as it was a craft decision, it was also, if I may use the term, a moral decision. And what I mean by that is, Mina, after all, is a character with no agency, with no voice. She is a character who has been acted upon her entire life, including the last horrific thing that was done to her. I felt like I couldn't be party to that. If I told Mina's section in the third person, I have no doubt that she would have still come across as a sympathetic character. I would have been able to present her backstory. I could have talked about her, love story and marriage to Abdul. I could have made it work. But there was no reason for me to intervene in that story. Mina was perfectly capable for once, for getting the last word, for being able to tell her own story. So that decision, I think, some of it flowed organically, but some of it was a deliberate, conscious decision to have that italicized sections be in the first person. The reason her section was so difficult to write, however, was I was trying really hard to do two things. One was, she's this young, unworldly, unsophisticated young woman. And I wanted to capture the flavor of that. I wanted that timid, tenuous, almost a little high-pitched kind of voice, but at the same time, I didn't want her to sound silly or, I wanted her, this is a woman who has taken tremendous chances, tremendous risks to stand up for what she wants, for what she believes. So she's a heroic character in many ways to me. And I wanted a kind of musicality in her voice, at the same time. I didn't need her to be profound, but I needed her sections to be really, really heartfelt. And walking that line, between those two seemingly contradictory impulses, I had to work really hard on I suspect it's no different than writing a poem. Smita's sections to me very much read as prose. It's the plot, you're forwarding the plot, you're taking the story forward. Mina's sections, if I did my job right, which I'm not at all convinced that I did, I wanted it to have an element of poetry in it,
It's not just the italics either, although those always help, but they do have a lyrical quality to them in the sense of, I often, when I'm talking to my students, speak of the difference between a prose narrative and a lyric poem as being in some ways the difference between a motion picture and a photograph, that each form can do something that the other cannot. Now you get to have it a little bit both ways in this novel because you're pushing the plot forward through the Smita sections, but then there are these brief, almost moments out of time. And certainly, there are a couple of moments that seem to be taking place from literally out of time, where Mina is contemplating, and we're getting a sort of lyric take on her own experience in the sort that we might expect from a dramatic monologue or some other type of poem. There are questions in the chat, so I'm going to defer to a couple of these now. Okay. Lisa's question is first, and then David, I will come back to you. So since we are talking about Mina, it seems an appropriate time also to ask, without spoiling anything, did you always know in the writing process what Mina's fate would ultimately be?
It's a great question. I'm honestly doing my best to try and remember so that I can get, because you do so many drafts and all that.
Forget, yeah.
It blurs, but I know that I'm the kind of writer who will not really start on a book until I have a pretty good idea of what the shape of the book will be and what the narrative arc of the book will be, which is not to say that endings don't change and beginnings don't change. I mean, they always do. Of course they do. But if I had to bet, and I'm truly just doing this, not based on memory, answering this question, but based on a hunch, if you will, based on what I know about myself, of the kind of writer I am, I would say that, yes, I had a fairly good idea of where this book is going to go. Thank you for that question.
And David would also like to know, if Honor or any of your other novels for that matter, there are characters based on people you know.
No, not a single one in Honor at all, other than what I have alluded to already, which is, I've thrown some of my own questions and dilemmas at Smita and figured, I'll just outsource this and she gets to solve it for me. The story that I told you earlier about my dad and how he behaved during that one incident, but he's not in the book. It's that kind of very faint outlines, borrowing from stories I've heard, that kind of stuff. But I'm trying to think if there's any except, Mohan, who we haven't talked about at all, who's probably my favorite character. He's the male character who accompanies Smita on this journey into the village where Meena lives. He's kind of her minder. He acts as a kind of translator for her because her Hindi is not all that great anymore. He's definitely based on the kind of happy-go-lucky, kind-hearted, roll up your sleeves and help somebody else kind of cousins and males that I grew up around. Again, I can't trace him to any one single character, but he is probably a composite of a lot of young men that I knew growing up.
It's interesting to hear how it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation character for character, but more how a composite might interact with a particular moment or a particular event that maybe gets borrowed, but changed in the process on the way.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
You did mention something to the effect of the book I'm working on now, and I know that I would get pilloried if I did not ask. Tell us what are you willing to tell us about that book?
It's a very different book than Honor. Honor has a larger canvas, I think. I like to do books that are a little larger, and then for my next book, I like to go, more intimate. So it's a domestic novel, and it's basically the story of a son and his mother and the very, very conflicted relationship that they've had for years. And events happen. He goes back to India for a visit, and while he's there, he discovers some truths about his family life that basically turn his world upside down. And the rest of the novel then becomes about what he's going to do next. It's a test for him. He now has this new body of facts, and how does that change his relationship with his mom? So it's a very different book.
They'll also pillory me if I don't ask. Any idea on how far along that is, when that might get into readers' hands?
I've done good work on it, so I don't know when it will be out in the world, but it shouldn't be terribly long.
Terribly long. Okay, a couple more things coming in the Q&A. Lisa wants to comment just that the last chapter of the book was a beautifully brilliant ending that moved her to tears. Lisa, I'm with you. I thought it was a terrific ending as well. And I'll read this comment from Jackie. Thrity, I love this book so much, as you know. As a reader who cares deeply about religion, culture, and feminist theology, I wonder if you would reflect on your experience having lived in such different settings and the reality of sexism across cultures and religions. And I'm even going to interrupt Jackie's comment to say that one of the lines that hit me most in the gut was the sense that Smita says a number of times, this happens everywhere. This is the sort of thing that happens everywhere. I confess that I had a hard time understanding the brothers, and they rang true in many ways to men in my own culture and experience. I say that, though, sharing your view of Mohan as my favorite character. He is also like many men I have known. And it's coming. Well, this is the Zoom world where our names are all of a sudden not the names that we thought they were. This is from Kate, not Jackie.
Oh, okay.
But hello to both.
Wow, that's such a multifaceted question. So I guess a quick history lesson, if I may. So I grew up in this very, very, very minuscule religion we're known as the Parsis of India, followers of an ancient Persian faith called Zoroastrianism. Kate, you probably, because of your background, you probably have heard about this. Most people have not. So my ancestors came to India from what used to be Persia, a good 1,000 years ago, right? And very much got involved in Indian culture, which is predominantly Hindu culture, although at least the India that I grew up in the 1970s was genuinely a melting pot. And I shouldn't even say India, I should just talk about the city of Bombay, because that's where I was born and raised. And it really was, I mean, I was a Parsi kid who went to a Catholic school and had friends who were Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, you name it. And it's only now that it occurs to me, we were in and out of each other's homes. We had sleepovers. Nobody ever gave a damn about any of this. All the problems that I think, unfortunately, are facing India today came about much later. So it was a very happy time in that sense. And the family that I grew up in, I don't know that my parents would have necessarily called themselves feminists, or the people around us would have defined themselves as that. But when it came to things that mattered, women being educated, there was never a question that you would just even quit after college. You would obviously go on and get a graduate degree. My father had a business in a predominantly conservative area. He had a factory there. Most of the people around him were men. The workers were men. The other merchants were men. The factory owners were men. He fought me tooth and nail throughout my teenage years, begging me to take over the family business. I don't think it occurred to him that being a female, I might be a real minority there, and perhaps this was something I shouldn't do. I only refused because I had it in my head that I wanted to be a writer. I knew I would get laughed out of town if I ever claimed to want to be a poet or a fiction writer. So I took the safe way out, and I said I wanted to be a journalist. And even that was like too woo-woo for him, and he was like, but we have a family business, why wouldn't you? So it's very difficult. Again, I don't think my father ever used the word feminist. I don't think those words came out of his lips, but he never ever said, this is something you cannot do because you're a woman. And when I decided to come to this country alone in a place where I didn't know a soul at age 21, once I convinced him that this was the right thing for me to do and that it would make me happy to do so, he was my number one defender, amongst all the other relatives who said, what are you doing? You're going to let your daughter, he wouldn't have any of it. And he was like, go and fly as high as you need to and want to. So it was a complicated but happy childhood in that sense.
I don't see any open questions now, so that means I get to sneak back in with mine. And this is not related to anything that has to do with the craft of writing. This is pure celeb gossip. Tell us about Reeses Book Club and what it's like to be now. I'm not just a member, but I would imagine an officer.
I don't know if I'm a member or an officer. All I know is I'm humbled and I'm deeply grateful that she chose the book as the January selection. I had actually found out about it several months in advance. The news was given to me by my publishing team, who actually, as it happened on my birthday in September, my editor wrote to me and said, can you hop on a Zoom call now? And my first immediate thought was, oh my God, she got another job. She's quitting on me and she wants to do this. So I said, no, I said, it's not a good time. I'm sorry. And she said, no, actually, we need you to get on the Zoom call right now. So I was like, this is odd, but I did. And I was greeted by about 6 smiling faces. The whole team was there, and they were just so thrilled And I was, of course, taken aback by the news, and I didn't even know that they had submitted it. I don't, till today, I don't quite understand or know how Reese's Book Club found out about the book. But their excitement and enthusiasm was so contagious that we were all just happy that day. And then came the tough part, which was keeping it a secret for almost 4 months after that, 3.5 months after that.
I bet. But then what was life like when all of a sudden Reese tweets a photo of herself holding the book? How did that change the authors?
Yeah, it was surreal. They made me do a lot of things that they kept posting on their app and on their website. Like I had to prepare an Indian, snack. I had to give them a list of songs that I thought worked well with the book. There were just all these.
For your playlist? You did a book?
Yeah, it's a playlist that's on Spotify actually right now.
Okay.
Yeah, you can look it up. So they were just they kept me really busy between September and January 4th, I think it was, and they kept once the cover reveal happened, they started posting a lot of those things. So it was a very interesting experience and an exciting time. And clearly the book did better because of her endorsement than it otherwise might have. And, and it's a serious topic, which by definition means it's a limited audience. And I think one of the ways in which this did help me is perhaps the book was introduced to a slightly wider audience than it otherwise would have been. So I'm grateful.
I am too. It's always a pleasure to have the chance to see someone whose work you admire suddenly. Not so suddenly. It's not like you just started writing overnight. But sometimes it seems sudden when all of a sudden a celebrity comes in and the work takes on a different amplification. David compliments you that you knew this before the Ohioana ceremony, and you kept the.
I made a blunder once, David. I posted, I don't know what it was. I posted something on Facebook, and it had the seal on the jacket, and I didn't think about it at all. And my editor and like the publicity people and the marketing people, like I was just bombarded with text messages and take it down now. And then Facebook being Facebook, I couldn't figure out how to delete the whole post right away. So it was the most excruciating 10 minutes of my life. But thankfully, I think nobody saw it and it was fine.
Nobody managed to screenshot this to.
No. And I just thought, my God, this is too much. Like, I'm not a good person to keep secrets like this,
It looks to me like we are coming up right about on time. So you and I, of course, can continue this with a second margarita, a second whiskey sometime soon. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you to David and to Courtney and everyone at Ohioana for providing us the opportunity to have this conversation. I want to thank all of you who joined us tonight, and especially for those of you who asked questions. And David has returned. So David, I will turn things back over to you.
Actually, I would, David, before you take over, I would just like to say a few words. One is absolutely big thank you to Ohioana and to David Weaver for planning this and organizing this event. But I also want to say something about my dearest friend and colleague, Dave Lucas, the gentleman who's been interviewing me all this time. Dave is a marvelous, marvelous poet. If you're not familiar with his poetry, please do yourself a favor and read his work. He's really terrific. And as I think you have sensed, he's also a fabulous human being. And it is truly one of the joys of my life to have Dave Lucas as my friend. So thank you, my friend, for doing this.
Just because you say that doesn't mean I'm gonna mow your lawn tomorrow. It's not.
We had a deal. You told me.
Well, I do want to say, and like I said, we actually, for the next couple of minutes, because I might want to say something or ask something. In fact, that Thrity, when when we wanted you to come for the Ohioana Book Festival, and I said, we have an idea that we might want to try something a little different, a one-on-one conversation. And my first thought was Dave Lucas. And so I contacted Dave because it had been a couple of years since Dave was at the 2019 Ohioana Book Festival, which happened to be our last live festival before COVID hit. And I said, Dave, Thritys coming to the book festival. Here's the idea we have for programming. Would you consider being the moderator? And he said, if it's Thritty, I'm there. I don't care when or where, what format. He said, I will always be happy to be there for my friend Thritty. So, and it certainly translates, the feeling that the two of you have for each other. And it is wonderful. I know that's been the world of COVID. I know we've all missed seeing each other so very much. I know the two of you both being colleagues at Case Western Reserve have been very difficult the last couple of years, for your students and who are all, of course, budding writers. We were actually talking about the other day last week, Stories of COVID-19, which was one of our panels. And we were talking about the fact that how crisis not only creates hardship, it also sparks creativity. And that a lot of probably writing of every kind, has come out. We were talking, one of the things we talked about was how in 1970, the Kent State shootings, that night, Neil Young saw the images on the television and he just got up and he went right in and he wrote, Tin Soldiers and Nixon Coming, 4 Dead in Ohio, one of the classic anthems. He had to respond to this situation by being creative. And I think, that's something where, who knows what works are going to come out of what we've all gone through in these last 2 years. So I know we're all excited to get back in person again. And I'm thrilled because it was just announced today, Thritty, the Summer Literary Picnic Series at Thurber House here in Columbus. And Thritty is going to be the guest on August the 6th. And I have the great pleasure of being the moderator for that program. So I'm delighted and looking forward.
That'll be terrific. Yeah.
To that. So Dave, you'll have to come down. You'll get a picnic lunch and a free drink.
My reputation precedes me.
Yeah, free drink. You didn't even have to promise him the picnic lunch. Free drink.
It helps.
No.
It helps.
Well, thank you again. This has been very terrific. Thrity Umrigar, Dave Lucas, my good friends, terrific writers, and a reminder that you can get copies of Thrity's book and all of the authors at the Ohioana Book Festival from the Book Loft at German Village at bookloft.com. I want to say thanks again to our festival sponsors and partners. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Check out our website because you will see all of the information about the programs that are coming up. Tomorrow, May the 1st, is the last day of the book festival, but everything is going to be added to our YouTube channel for Ohioana. So if maybe you missed a little part of this conversation or you'd love to see it again, it's going to be up on Ohioana's YouTube channel. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Thritty and Dave, and I hope to see you all in person soon.
Thank you to my two favorite Daves. Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
You're going to make Giffels mad with that, but that's fine. He can live.
Well, yeah, I'll make it up to him. I'll buy him a beer. Yeah. See you guys.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all, and good night.
Bye. Good night.